When I took moral philosophy courses when I was in college, I was a philosophy major, I studied the work of a well-known contemporary British philosopher named Derek Parfit. Derek Parfit has a theory called the bias of the near, which essentially boils down to the following. All people have a preference for the things that are closest to them, both in the realm of space and in the realm of time. For example, we care much more about people who live in our own neighborhood than we do about people who live on the other side of the world. And in terms of time, we care much more about things that are going to happen to us tomorrow than we do about things that will happen a year from now, let alone 10 years from now. That's why people make bad decisions in the short term, even if they know that those decisions will affect them negatively in the long term. Take smoking, for example. Everyone knows that smoking cigarettes isn't good for you, but people also know that they're probably not going to get lung cancer from smoking tomorrow. Maybe they'll get cancer years down the road, but not tomorrow, and smoking that cigarette feels so good right now. So, people decide to smoke. Because instant gratification almost always takes precedence over concern for long-term ramifications. That's called the bias of the near. And of course, that concept applies to people in our lives as well. This week's Torah portion, Parshat Emor, lays out the laws of the Kohanim, the priests who served as the ritual leaders first in the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary that functioned as our center of worship during our 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and later in the temple in Jerusalem. And the Parsha tells us that Kohanim are prohibited from coming into contact with a corpse or even entering a cemetery because contact with a dead body would render a Cohen ritually impure. But there is an exception. Kohanim are allowed, and in fact are actually obligated, to attend the funerals of their immediate relatives, parents and siblings, and later on the rabbis added spouses to that list as well. The obligation for a Kohen to mourn an immediate family member supersedes the prohibition against a Kohen incurring a state of ritual impurity. Because thousands of years before Derek Parfit was born, the Torah already understood the notion of the bias of the near. It's fundamental to human nature that we give preference to the things which are closest to us. And of course, our immediate family members should always be the closest things in our lives. But the truth is, giving preferential treatment to the things or the people who are closest to us in our lives isn't actually all that impressive. In fact, really, that's just the baseline. That's the bare minimum. Of course we should give preferential treatment to our immediate family members. That's obvious. It's almost a self-evident truth. What isn't so obvious is that to be a truly morally upstanding person, we need to extend that same level of care beyond our immediate circle. If the person right next to you was starving, of course you would offer them food. It wouldn't even be a question. But according to Derek Parfit, the true test of the strength of our moral character is whether or not we have the ability to recognize that people who are starving on the other side of the world are just as real, just as human, and just as worthy of receiving our support as the people who are starving in our own community. In other words, true morality means transcending the bias of the near. Caring not only for those who are closest to us, but caring for everyone. This past Wednesday, we were honored to welcome Dan Grunfeld, son of the legendary New York Knicks player and general manager Ernie Grunfeld, to Temple Beth Shalom. And Dan shared his remarkable family story with us. His grandparents survived the Holocaust and ultimately made it to the United States, where his father became a college basketball superstar, then an Olympic gold medalist, and finally an NBA legend. And Dan's wonderful book, By the Grace of the Game, tells really the unbelievable story of his family's journey from Auschwitz to the NBA. But as his 98-year-old Holocaust survivor grandmother often reminds him, none of the Grunfeld family's success would have been even remotely possible without the help of one of the great heroes of the Holocaust, Raoul Wallenberg. If you've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, then you know that it's on Raoul Wallenberg Place. And Dan Grunfeld's grandmother survived the Budapest ghetto and made it to the United States due entirely to Wallenberg's incredible courage and compassion. For those who don't know his story, Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who saved 100,000 Hungarian Jews in the final months of the Holocaust. And he did it by issuing protective passes called Schutzpasses to Jews living in the Budapest ghetto. A Schutzpass identified the possessor as a Swedish subject awaiting repatriation, and it was a legitimate enough document to help thousands of Jews, including Ernie Grunfeld's mother, evade the Nazis until the end of the war. And when they visited the Holocaust Museum together, the one spot in the museum that Dan Grunfeld's grandmother felt that he was absolutely obligated to see was the memorial to Raoul Wallenberg. As he writes in his book, she pointed at his face and made me promise that I would remember him. And she made me promise that when I had kids, that they would know about him too. Just last month, a new book called In the Garden of the Righteous by the acclaimed journalist Richard Horowitz was published. And the book tells 10 lesser-known stories of righteous Gentiles during the Holocaust. And Richard Horowitz was inspired to write the book because it has always deeply disturbed him that everyone, Jews included, maybe especially Jews, knows the names Hitler and Eichmann and Mengele, but very few people can name even a single righteous Gentile beyond Oskar Schindler. And of course, that should not be the case. It shouldn't be that we all know the names of those who tried to destroy us, but almost none of us know the names of those who tried to save us. And at the dedication ceremony for the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, which took place on May 1st, 1962, exactly 61 years ago this week, Golda Meir said the following: "The Jewish people remember not only the villains, but also every small detail of the rescue attempts. The rescuers were like drops of love in an ocean of poison. They not only saved Jews, but they saved faith and hope in the human spirit. We must honor those who stood up for the persecuted, often at the risk of their own lives, when so few did." It's human nature to look out for those who are closest to us, our immediate family members, those in our community, our fellow Jews. But true morality means going above and beyond that, transcending the bias of the near. And as Dan Grunfeld, Richard Horowitz, and Golda Meir all point out, that is precisely what the righteous Gentiles did during the Shoah. They risked their lives for strangers with whom they had no real connection and no good reason to protect. According to our tradition, Pharaoh's daughter, who rescued an infant Moses from the Nile River, is the first righteous Gentile in history. And the rabbis of the Talmud teach that because of her compassion and her selflessness, she was one of only 9 people ever permitted to enter paradise while still living. And the name that Pharaoh's daughter gave to Moses, Moshe, it's an Egyptian name. And that's the name that he used for the rest of his life. And even God used that name, a name given to Moses by a non-Jewish Egyptian princess. In other words, God agrees with Derek Parfit. In our tradition, the people who are held in the highest regard are those who care for others outside of their immediate circle. The most righteous people among us are those who are able to overcome the bias of the near. As this week's Torah portion makes clear, it is critically important to care deeply for those who are closest to us. But it's equally as important, maybe even more important, to care just as deeply for those who are not close to us. To follow in the footsteps of Pharaoh's daughter and Oskar Schindler, and Raoul Wallenberg. Because in the words of Golda Meir, that is how we will save hope and maintain faith in the human spirit. Shabbat Shalom.